Islam and Christianity. Throughout history, these two great religions of the world clashed numerous times, attempting to expand their own influence across the globe. Whether it be the Crusades, the Muslim invasion of Spain, and the conquest of the Ottoman Empire, Islam and Christianity clashed for centuries without end. The European continent saw some of the bloodiest and biggest wars happen between these two religions. The Ottoman Empire was slowly and steadily pushing more and more into the heart of Europe, while the Austrian Empire proved to be the greatest enemy and roadblock to the Ottomans and their ambitions. In 1683, the Ottoman Empire attempted one final strike against their Habsburg rival to take the city of Vienna and finally prove to be the greatest power in Europe. But the Austrians, along with the Holy League, defeated the Ottomans at Vienna and started pushing them slowly out of Europe. For these actions, Austria was seen as the defender of Christendom against the Muslim Ottoman Empire. After the Great Turkish War, the Ottoman Empire became weaker and weaker with every century that passed and struggled to keep control over her European territories with the rise of nationalism across the Balkans. While this was happening, the Austrian Empire started expanding its influence across the Balkans and other parts of Europe. In 1878, the Austrians attended the Congress of Berlin with the aim of reorganizing the states in the Balkans after the Russo-Turkish War. After the negotiations, Bosnia and Herzegovina would be ceded to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but this region was majority Muslim. For the first time, the empire was about to gain a large amount of Muslims living inside its territory. So how did the former defender of Christendom treat the Muslim inhabitants of this newly obtained land? Were they about to forcefully Christianize Bosnia and force the Muslims out? Or is Kaiser Franz Josef gonna take a different approach towards dealing with the Muslim population of Bosnia? This was not the first time the Austrians crossed into the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina. During the Great Turkish War, the famous Field Marshal Prince Eugene of Savoy entered Bosnia together with his soldiers, managing to push the Turks back and took the city of Sarajevo. The entire city was burned to the ground by his forces, and Eugene states in his diary, quote, "On October 23rd, I deployed units on a hill that dominated the city itself. From there, I sent certain detachments to ravage the city. The evening before, the city was on fire. We left the city and the whole area up in flames. I stayed in Sarajevo the next day. Our assault detachment, which pursued the enemy, returned with rich booty and with many women and children after they had killed all the forces of the Turks. If there was preparation, the whole kingdom could be occupied and held." End quote. Because of this, General Josip Filipović thought that the occupation would be extremely easy with barely any resistance. With 82,000 Austrian soldiers, he marched into Bosnia, expecting a swift and quick occupation. However, he was wrong. Bosniaks put up extreme resistance against his army. Despite being relatively poorly equipped, the Bosniaks inflicted heavy casualties onto Filipović's army, to the point that the general, by the end of August, requested an additional 300,000 soldiers for the occupation. According to Filipović himself, when his soldiers reached Sarajevo, he described the battle as, quote, "There ensued one of the most terrible battles conceivable. The troops were fired upon from every house, from every window, from each split door, and even women took part." But eventually, Bosnia and Herzegovina was subdued by the Austro-Hungarian Empire and managed to crush the last remaining insurgents. But it was far from a walk in the park like Filipović thought it would be. One of the consequences of the occupation was the fact that a good number of Bosniaks, remembering the last time what happened when Bosnia was conquered by the Austrians, chose to flee the region towards Constantinople and Anatolia. In total, the Muslim population of Bosnia dropped by 13% due to them fearing genocide and oppression. Bosnia and Herzegovina was now firmly in the hands of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. What will this now mean for the Muslim population under their new Catholic masters? During the occupation, Emperor Franz Joseph I tried his best to psychologically prepare the population for the new government. The emperor, instead of choosing a policy of religious oppression, wanted to show the Bosniak population that they had nothing to fear, so it was proclaimed that Muslims would enjoy full religious freedom under the empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire wanted to turn Bosnia and Herzegovina into a model colony, so they started rapidly industrializing the land and implemented numerous Western reforms in the region. Along with the modernization and industrialization of cities, also came the modernization of mosques as well. Mosques in Bosnia were among the very first in the world to receive electricity, with the minarets now being able to glow at night, especially during Islamic holidays. The Austrians also introduced microphones to the mosques as well, and with it, the call to prayer could be heard much further away. The emperor also started getting in on the modernization of Islamic institutions. While the city mosque in Sazin was under construction in 1880, Emperor Franz Joseph I personally donated a custom chandelier for the mosque as a sign of compassion for the Muslims in Krajina, and that exact chandelier still hangs in the mosque to this very day. Slowly but surely, the fears of genocide and oppression started washing away for Bosniak Muslims. Instead of persecuting them, the Austrians were actually assisting them and modernizing their religious buildings and institutions. Some of the families who fled Bosnia during the invasion even returned to the region. When it comes to the structure of the Islamic clergy, there was no hierarchically organized clergy in the Western sense. The authorities were local muftis appointed by the Sultan to organize religious life. This mixture of spiritual and temporal power without clear structures was unacceptable to the Austro-Hungarian authorities. The government then decided to lay the foundations of a national church for the Bosniak Muslims within the empire. In 1882, the Bosnian ulema was officially established, and thus the Bosniak Muslims now had their own organized clergy under Austrian supervision. The head of the ulema, the reis or Grand Mufti, was always appointed by the emperor, and the Bosnian Grand Mufti had control over the Sharia courts in the region. As citizens of the empire, Bosniak Muslims were subject to Austro-Hungarian civil law, but there were certain exceptions for this. Matters like inheritance, marriage, and allowance were only to be carried out through the Sharia law courts instead of civil courts, which other religious groups had to go through. The integration of Bosniak Muslims in the country also meant that Muslims would start to move to other parts of the monarchy, like for educational purposes. According to the 1910 census, there were over 2,000 Muslims in the Austrian part of the dual monarchy. For this reason, the current law on religious freedom, which had previously only been applied to Bosnia, was considered as insufficient because it did not meet the demands of the Muslims in other parts of the empire, and thus the Islam law of 1912 was passed, which recognized Islam as an official religion in the Austrian half of the empire. This would mean that Muslims could establish their own communities in other parts of the empire, as well as fund the construction of religious buildings. A prime example of this was the planned construction of a mosque in the empire's capital, Vienna. The emperor himself even supported the plans for a mosque in the capital so much that he donated over 250,000 guilders for its construction, an idea that would have been considered outrageous only 300 years earlier. But of course, nothing is perfect at the end of the day, and there were indeed times when the Austro-Hungarian Empire carried out an action which was not in the benefit of the Muslim community. One of these is the ban on the Arabica script, which was the Bosnian variant of the Arabic script written in the Bosnian language. This was one of the efforts of the empire to westernize the region more. While Arabica was still used in a few religious schools, officially the Latin and Cyrillic script were used in the public. There was an attempt to adopt the Arabica as the third official alphabet by the Bosniak Muslims, but sadly it failed. The general amount of tolerance the Austro-Hungarian authorities gave to the Muslims in Bosnia was truly surprising, and all of that tolerance was not in vain. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, the infamous anti-Serb riots in Sarajevo broke out, in which thousands of Muslims flocked to the streets and started destroying the properties of ethnic Serbs while waving the flag of the dual monarchy as well as paintings of the emperor. The Bosniak Muslims were in fact one of the most loyal subjects of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and this was especially shown in the army and on the front lines. When it comes to Bosniak regiments in the First World War, there are a whole bunch of things to unpack, and the topic itself deserves its very own video in the future. In conclusion, Muslims in the empire went from being the most hostile religious group within it to being one of, if not the most loyal subjects. The amount of tolerance and representation given to them by the emperor and the Vienna court truly paid off, and with it, the Muslims were successfully integrated into the dual monarchy.